All right, well, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here this afternoon for our second CSSR winter webinar. My name's Sarah Wilkins-Laflamme. I'm an assistant prof at the University of Waterloo. I will be your Zoom master for this webinar. And just a few quick notes before we get started officially with the introductions and the presentation. Just so things run smoothly, as usual, just asking you to stay muted if you're not the speaker. If you have any questions for the Q&A, please post either the question itself or just an indication that you'd like to ask the question in the chat at any time throughout the presentation. Jonas will speak for about half an hour. And then we'll have about half an hour for Q&A. And so then our chair, Alicia, will then just kind of prompt you to ask your question when we start the Q&A. So without further ado, Alicia, our chair today, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So my name is Alicia Cummins, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Ottawa. Today we have Jonas Brandt speaking to us on his paper, The Politics of the Hidden Soul, Judicial Ethics in Augustine's City of God. Jonas has an honors bachelor's degree from the University of Winnipeg with a major in religion and culture and a minor in philosophy. He is currently in the second year and his final year of his master's degree in religious studies at McMaster University. His research focuses on the area of religion and politics, and he is presently writing his thesis on the work of Charles Taylor and Jeffrey Stout, specifically in regards to their shared conception of the expressive value of religion. So I'd like to thank Jonas for being with us today. And a reminder, if you have any questions, just post them in the chat and we'll turn to them at the end. Thanks again.
All right, hi everyone. Thanks for showing up to this. Thanks, Alicia, for that introduction. And also thanks to Sarah for putting this on. I just learned that Sarah is somewhat responsible for this whole webinar series that CSSR is doing. So I think it's a really great way to stay connected academically during these sort of unprecedented and rather unusual times. So because of COVID kind of shutting everything down last year, I was forced to move from Hamilton, where I was doing my a master's degree at McMaster University. So I am, as such, now calling you live from Winnipeg, Manitoba, from my home province. And also because of COVID shutting everything down last year, I wasn't able to present this paper for the class, which I wrote it for. So thanks also to Sarah for letting me finally get my research out there. Feels nice after the paper has just been sitting on a file on my computer for the last year. So it's going to finally get the chance to see the light of day. So this paper is really built around two opposing interpretations of Augustine's political thought, specifically in relationship to his judicial ethics. So I looked first at a realist interpretation of him, and then secondly, an interpretation that is critical of the realists. So I attempt to compare and contrast their interpretations, specifically in regards to Chapter 6 of Book 19 of Augustine's magnum opus, The City of God. So Book 19, just as a small side note, has been very important in the Western, so the history of Western political thought. And just as another side note, last January, I don't know if anybody watched Joe Biden's presidential inauguration speech, but he actually cited Augustine from Book 19 in that speech. He referenced Augustine's definition of a people as a multitude defined by the common objects of their love. So when I had seen that he had done this, I had one of those rare moments of, yes, an important and influential person is citing the ancient author that I am studying. It's possibly an all too rare experience for those of us who study ancient authors and texts. So a little bit of validation for the religious studies degree. Which was great. Although discussing that portion of Book 19 isn't what the paper is on, so I'll have to return to my topic. So the portion of Book 19 I'm looking at again is Book 6, which deals with the problem of judicial ethics, and specifically the dilemma of a judge who is forced to render judgments out of ignorance, as the consciences of those who he is judging will remain ultimately hidden from him. So Augustine begins the chapter by remarking that those who give judgments in the court can never penetrate the consciences of those upon whom they pronounce it. So he then goes on to describe the kind of violence perpetrated on individuals brought forward to the court, specifically the torture used to produce confessions. So although the practice of torture he's describing might be particular to his own particular historical context, so 5th century CE in the Roman Empire, this general problem of judicial violence, I would argue, is very much with us today, even if in a slightly different form. So all of this pain and confusion in the courts, indeed all of this violence, is ultimately traced by Augustine to the problem of hiddenness, so that the judge is unable to properly assess the guilt or innocence of the suspected party. So Augustine therefore says that the ignorance of the judge is very frequently a calamity to the innocent. So this chapter on the judge has been a central point of emphasis for realist interpreters of Augustine. So this realist interpretation is the first one that I'm going to consider in relationship to chapter 6. So the second line of interpretation I locate is found in a number of recent commentators who have been critical of the realists. So I look at the Augustine scholars Veronica Ogle and Eric Gregory in this regard. So just to give some quick background for who the realists are. So the realist interpretation of Augustine's political thought really begins with the American theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who famously stated that Augustine was the first great realist in Western history. So he wrote this in a classic essay from 1953 called Augustine's Political Realism. So the idea for Niebuhr is that Augustine's political realism follows from his strong emphasis on the role of sin in human life, the sin which causes the disorders we see in society. So it's the pride of self-love in particular, which causes each human being to seek their own good at the expense of others, even to the point of wanting to dominate others. So this is what Augustine called the libido dominandi, so the will or the lust to dominate. So Niebuhr writes, "It is this powerful self-love, this tendency of the self to make itself its own end, which sows confusion into every human community." So as a result, Niebuhr says that political order cannot be achieved without the imposition of power. Following Niebuhr is the notable Augustine scholar Robert A. Marcus, who, like Niebuhr, emphasizes the role of politics in restraining the selfish passions of human beings. So coercive power is then the main route by which such order can be imposed, which includes, of course, the order imposed by the court. So Marcus specifically says of the judge of chapter 6 in book 19, that there is a deeply disturbing realism in Augustine's parable of the judge, who finds himself frustrated in his quest for justice. So he writes that this judge is Augustine's epitome of the man most fully engaged in the necessities of society. So namely the judgments that are made necessary by the prevalence and pervasiveness of evil and sin. So more recently, the political theorist John Parish has developed an analogous reading of Augustine's realism to Niebuhr and Marcus. However, Parish develops his interpretation specifically in conjunction with the problem of hiddenness that I've been alluding to. So Parish says that it is the opacity of human existence that makes the moral evils characteristic of political action both necessary and endurable. So this is a view he's attributing to Augustine. So Parish continues, "It is our helplessness to distinguish definitively among inner moral phenomena that both requires and excuses the brutality of our public actions." So he's basically saying that Augustine thinks that the brutality of the court's actions are justified in the light of their near total ignorance. So it's part of my intention in this paper to contest the sort of very grim picture that the realists give of Augustine's political thought. So although it's safe to say that Augustine was pessimistic about the sort of quality of justice that could be attained in human courts, he is nevertheless deeply concerned with issues of violence, suffering, and the philosophies that he think that deal inadequately with these issues. So I'll be discussing Stoicism in particular as an object of critique in chapter 6 in relation to his judicial ethics. So despite this problem I have with the realist reading, there is indeed, I believe, some merit to their interpretation, insofar as they rightly note that Augustine does admit the necessity of passing down judgment, as miserable as this necessity might be. So as the realists note, Augustine admits that the judge is compelled to pass down judgment, as not judging would mean forsaking a duty to society. And so because of this, the realists take this chapter by Augustine to be a paradigmatic instance of his realism, that Augustine is willing to admit and accept, perhaps even to endorse, the harshness involved in attaining justice in human affairs, that our political and judicial practices are necessary evils that forestall the greater evil of non-action. So Augustine writes that given the choice between sitting on the judge's seat or not, the quote, wise man will always do so because the claims of human society, which he thinks it wicked to abandon, constrain him and draw him to this duty. So it's passages like these that the realists tend to emphasize in Augustine. So the critics of the realist reading that I've already mentioned, Veronica Ogle and Eric Gregory, argue that while Augustine indeed does endorse the provisional necessity for judgment in courts of law, he is nonetheless interested in critiquing the characters of those who pass down such judgments. So what kind of person, Augustine seems to ask, can participate in such a violent juridical system and remain unscathed? So Augustine considers two possible reactions that a judge might have to be involved in such a violent system of the court. So one way is found in Stoic philosophy, which I've already mentioned, which seeks to distance itself from human suffering by cultivating apatheia, which just means freedom for passion, literally meaning without passion. And the alternative to the Stoic option that Augustine is going to recommend is, as many of you perhaps will guess, the Christian option. So for Augustine, the virtue of Christianity is that it allows one to cultivate a sort of empathetic affectivity in response to the suffering of the other, basically providing a more humane response to human suffering than that found in Stoicism. And then additionally, for Augustine, Christianity will also counsel humility for the judge in light of their ignorance when rendering judgment. So in this regard, Augustine would approve of Paul's line that we see through a glass darkly, meaning that our vision is severely impaired in matters of ultimate importance. And so as a result, the judge ought to humble him or herself in light of their ignorance. So I should mention that the realist interpreters of chapter 6 don't even seem to consider the possibility that Augustine is giving a critique of Stoicism here. And I tend to agree with Ogle and Gregory that this is a major oversight on their part. So Ogle wants to locate this critique of Stoicism by reading chapter 6 in continuity with the rest of book 19. She makes the point that Augustine begins this book with a critique of Greco-Roman philosophy, including Stoicism, and she thinks that this should inform our reading of Augustine's Judge. So Ogle notes that the central critique of Stoicism with which Augustine begins book 19 is focused on the Stoic conception of happiness, which for them is a matter of freeing oneself from suffering through the kind of cultivation of apatheia, which I've already mentioned. So this issue of happiness in the context of ancient philosophy requires a bit of unpacking, given the rather distinct understanding we have of it nowadays. So happiness for us is usually understood as a kind of positive emotional state, sort of a feeling of being happy, whereas in ancient philosophy, it has to do with the end or goal of human life. So it's basically a state of flourishing as opposed to simply being happy sort of in the moment. So for the Greeks, happiness was called Eudaimonia, and Augustine's preferred Latin term for it is beatitudo, which we could also render as blessedness, which has a more sort of Christian theological connotation. So in Stoic thought, happiness is achieved by reaching a state of equanimity or ataraxia, calm in the face of the constantly changing nature of life, which is what ultimately causes suffering for them. So again, apatheia is the way in which this state of passionlessness can be achieved. And because passion is equivalent with suffering, freedom from passion or freedom from emotion means freedom from suffering as such. So Augustine's critique of the Stoic conception of happiness is rather simple, as he thinks that all human attempts to achieve achieve happiness are going to fail. So the Stoic sage who cultivates their virtues through self-discipline is fighting a losing battle, Augustine thinks, as the happiness of this life is incredibly fleeting and cannot be never attained in full. So the many miseries that we experience as human beings, whether physically, psychologically, or socially, are all too real on Augustine's account, and those who deny their reality are filled with not only a dangerous sort of pride in thinking that they can transcend suffering, but also a sort of self-delusion. So he says of the Stoics that they shamelessly contend that such ills of human life are not really ills at all. So Augustine thinks that this isn't just plain wrong, that we do after all suffer in very real sorts of ways, but also he thinks that this kind of thinking is detrimental to one's moral and ethical character. So in the case of the judge, for example, their humanity will be compromised by their attempt to disavow the real problem of suffering. So August says in relation to this that for Augustine, rather than avoiding irrational emotions, those who seem to have achieved this blessed state have actually rendered themselves unfeeling. So elsewhere in City of God, Augustine references, though, like the Stoics, who are not stirred by any emotions at all. These people, Augustine says, rather than achieving a true tranquility, actually suffer an entire loss of their humanity. So this description is very apt for the figure of the Stoic judge that Augustine ultimately critiques in chapter 6. For example, when discussing the torments that the judge can inflict on potentially innocent individuals, Augustine says that the judge does not think it a wickedness that the innocent are tortured, or even that the confessions given under duress will be false. The philosopher, he says, does not consider that these many and grievous evils are sins. August therefore argues that for Augustine, while Stoicism may allow the judge to take a seat with equanimity, it is only because he has abstracted himself from the tragedy that surrounds him. So Eric Gregory is the other Augustine scholar who I've already mentioned, is critical of the realist interpretation of chapter 6. So here I'm drawing from his 2008 book, Politics and the Order of Love. So in this book, Gregory makes the case that the realist emphasis on the sinfulness and disorder of human societies ends up committing them to a status quo politics that does not sufficiently reflect on the balance required in a truly just society. So this is the balance between judgment on the one hand and compassion for suffering on the other. So along with August, Gregory thinks that Augustine's judge is a figure who should be critiqued and not merely admired. So August and Gregory also detect a certain irony in Augustine's presentation of the judge that they think the realists fail to see. So while the realists tend to read this chapter straightforwardly, so understanding the judge to represent the sort of public official who makes the best of a bad situation, they argue that there's a good case to be made for understanding it rather ironically, as Augustine takes the tropes associated with Stoicism, so calm in the face of suffering, the dispassionate rendering of judgment, these sorts of things. So he takes these tropes associated with Stoicism and then subverts them by characterizing the passionless judge as actually being the most miserable person of them all. So as Augustine writes towards the end of the chapter, can a judge who tortures innocent persons really be happy? Really, Augustine seems to be saying in incredulity. And so I'll just read sort of a lengthy quote from chapter 6 that sort of gets at the heart of what Augustine is trying to do here. So he writes, he, the judge, does not think it a wickedness that innocent witnesses should be tortured in cases which are not their own, or that the accused are so often overcome by such great pain that they make false confessions and are punished in spite of their ignorance. Nor does he think it wicked that, even if not condemned to die, they very often die under torture or as a result of torture. Ultimately, Augustine writes, the philosopher does not consider that these many and grievous evils are sins. So I would argue here that it's quite clear that Augustine is critiquing the Stoic indifference to suffering that he sees in their philosophy, and the realist overlooking of this is a major interpretive oversight on their part. So Robert Marcus, as I mentioned, is one of the realist interpreters who tends not to see this ironic resonance in Augustine's writing, and as such ends up asserting that Augustine is merely straightforwardly endorsing the actions of the judge. So Marcus, for example, writes that the judge is Augustine's epitome of the individual most fully engaged in the necessities of society. So while I don't think Mark is necessarily wrong to read into this account what he calls the disturbing realism of Augustine's parable of the judge, Marcus nowhere suggests that what might be at play here is in fact a rhetorically framed ironic critique of such a judge. So Gregory's critique of Marcus and the rest of the realists is that they tend to collapse all theology into a never-ending story about politics as a result, as a response to sin, which can all too easily collapse into a status quo defeatism. So I agree with Gregory that the realist retrieval of Augustine's account of the judge is indeed largely one of maintaining the status quo. Gregory suggests that in Marcus's interpretation, Augustine's portrait of the anxious utilitarian judge who must torture innocents seems to be the paradigm for all civic responsibility. The alternative reading that Gregory wants to recommend instead highlights Augustine's severely critical and ironic tone when speaking of the inhumane character of the Stoic judge. So having gone through this critique of the realist interpretation of chapter 6, I feel like I can probably draw sort of the formal part of this presentation to a close. I think, however, it would be remiss to end a presentation on Augustine without referencing one of his citations from scripture in regards to this topic. So for those who have read Augustine, you'll probably have recognized that it seems like on every page or on every other page, he'll be either citing or alluding to portions of scripture. And this also goes for his 1,000+ pages of the City of God. So I'm going to reference a scriptural passage that speaks in particular to this problem of hiddenness and judgment that I've been alluding to throughout the paper. So towards the end of City of God, Augustine cites the Apostle Paul from 1 Corinthians, where Paul writes, "Judge nothing before the time until the Lord come, who will both bring to light the hidden things of darkness and will make manifest the thoughts of the heart." So ultimately, Augustine believes that the problem of hiddenness, which he thinks is the sort of endemic feature of humanity's fallen state, will be undone at the eschaton, or at the end of all things. More importantly, though, in light of this discussion of judicial ethics, is Paul's invocation to judge nothing, at least until all things hidden have been revealed. So it's this tension in Augustine's theology that I want to conclude with, the tension between being compelled to judge in situations that demand justice on the one hand, but also to recognize the heavy burden of such judgment while the consciences of others remain hidden from us. I should also note that Augustine ends chapter 6 with another scriptural passage from the Psalms. So he prefaces this by writing, "Surely it would be more compassionate if the judge were to acknowledge that the necessity of acting in this way is a miserable one, if he hated his own part in it, and if he cried out to God," and this is the line from the Psalms, "From my necessities, deliver thou me." So it's ultimately this sort of disposition of penitential humility that Augustine recommends to the judge, a humility that acknowledges one ignorance when the truth is hidden. So that's all I have prepared for this paper. And if we want to go to the Q&A period now, I think that would be appropriate. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jonas. And I forgot to mention at the very beginning of this is that Jonas was actually our CSSR graduate paper prize winner. So he won for 2020, and unfortunately because of COVID, we weren't able to celebrate with him. So this was a great opportunity for us to recognize this achievement. So thank you again, Jonas, and congratulations. Any questions from the audience? Well, I have a question. So in regards to the critique of Apathy, and am I saying that right?
I'm not a Greek.
Okay,
I'm not a Greek scholar by any means, but
then I'm saying it right.
Yeah, Apathy, something like that.
Apathia. Okay,
yeah,
fine.
That's where we get our term pathos from. So I don't know.
Okay. So in terms of the critique of Apathia or Apathia, is it not reasonable to think that judges should be objective, and that being overly passionate could lead to mistaken judgments about certain cases? Does Augustine totally dismiss Apathia, or does he still think there is a role for being able to control one's emotions when deciding on important issues?
Yeah, so Augustine, I think, is a bit more subtle on this question than I might have sort of been talking about in regards to his critique of Stoicism. So when he talks about the Stoics, he's going to be very critical of their kind of use of Apathia, but he does think there is a role for sort of being in control of one's emotions, or I think he would think of it more as sort of cultivating a correct response to one's emotions. So he thinks that the Stoic way of cultivating freedom from passion means sort of being totally insensitive to the emotion one feels, like especially in response to suffering. But so for Augustine, the exemplar of how one should relate to one's emotions will always be Christ. So he points to portions in scripture where Christ is compassionate and sort of responds appropriately to that compassion through acts of healing, acts of mercy, and other sorts of works of charity that respond to suffering in this kind of way. So he does want to say that the judge should be responsive to these sort of real displays of suffering that he's witnessing or perhaps even causing. So he's going to be, I think, a little bit more subtle on this question of apatheia than I was maybe sort of outlining in the critique of Stoicism.
And since you look at religion and politics, I guess I kind of have a follow-up question. How do you see this debate or this discussion kind of playing out today? Are we still seeing, Augustine's ethics kind of being playing out in social justice movements today, whether in North America or South America?
Yeah, that's a very big question because the legacy of Augustine is so sort of complicated and multivariate. So we see the new president of the United States sort of citing him as this sort of political theological authority on the one hand. So I think we need to be careful when talking about Augustine's sort of role in cultivating sort of the politics that we want to see in society today. So I mentioned Eric Gregory. So he basically spends a whole book outlining what he thinks could be sort of an Augustinian approach to democratic citizenship. So how we could maybe appropriate some of the positive aspects of his theology into kind of maybe sort of cultivating these affective and empathetic forms of politics that are maybe somewhat missing in the kind of justice movements we see today. And so obviously living in the world of 2021, we've seen the sort of horrific recent stories of either police or judicial violence being enacted that have kind of caused these huge movements, the Black Lives Matter movement and all these types of things. So I think I don't want to make Augustine a spokesperson for these movements because he's, as I've said, he's coming from a very different part of history, and as such, I don't think we can like straightforwardly just sort of supplant him into our time and say, here, Augustine has all these answers for the social justice and racial justice issues we see today. But I think in terms of his frequent emphasis on the role of humanitas, his Latin term for kind of cultivating one's humanity in response to the suffering of the other, I think in that respect we could maybe find a good sort of ethical way into his political thought.
So just to jump in here, so like I am by no means any kind of specialist on the classics, so bear with me like if my question is really basic. But so in the way I kind of got from your paper, Jonas, is that for Augustine, like the figure of the judge is almost like an inevitable figure, right? Like it's again that you kind of talk about that pulling of, you know, like in one sense, like it's not really a profane or earthly endeavor. Ultimately, it will be at the end of times that this will properly happen, if you will. But you know, there's this kind of innate human need to address and judge to achieve justice. So, do you think that Augustine was actually like in favor of, like, say, the figure of the judge that we have now in our judicial system? Do you think maybe he would have wanted something else, was maybe aiming for something else, is like kind of like an ideal in society? Where are your kind of thoughts on where we're at now with this kind of the judicial system we have now and the figure of the judge that we have in our societies?
Yeah, so maybe one way of talking about this is in terms of some of the advice that he would give. So we have maybe a fuller sort of picture of what his judicial ethics were from some of his letters that he wrote to Roman officials, sort of counseling them on sort of concrete matters of justice. And in those letters, he was really trying to appeal to their sort of better nature in sort of allowing for a more humane form of justice than that found in the Roman judicial culture of his day, which was in particular influenced by Stoicism. So yeah, he does think that perhaps the figure of the judge is inevitable, given that there will always be sin on his account, or we might think of it as there's always going to be people doing bad things to other human beings that we somehow need to corral so that they're not, running rampant, as difficult as these sort of decisions when it comes down to it might be. And then the other issue would be, of course, that in his time, there was this kind of distinction between the civic court and then the ecclesial court, or the church court. So it was in the sort of church court that I think Augustine had a bit more sway, as he was a bishop. And so he was trying to really reform the sort of church councils of his day to be more humane in their response to matters of justice and sort of rendering judgment in issues where the truth wasn't always that clear. So yeah, he does think that the judge is going to be inevitable and is always going to be with us to some extent or other, but he does think, I think, that reform is possible to a certain degree, but it's always going to be incomplete, and it's always going to be very much an imperfect sort of reform, given the very much fallen nature that Augustine sees in human beings as a whole. So.
Yeah, Lorraine, go ahead. You're on mute. Oh, you're still on mute.
Sorry, forget it was a two-step thing. I just following up sort of on Alicia's question about social justice and whether Augustine sort of provides this kind of, ethics for the contemporary world kind of thing. And I'm just interested in what I've seen a lot in pop culture recently in terms of kind of Christian, or really Catholic redemptive type of masculinity in pop culture, like Blue Bloods. Sorry, I'm just gonna mute and get the dog.
You have to get the dog to feature in the video. Oh no. Okay.
Oh, I was going to say, let's bring the dog. Just bring the dog.
Bring the dog, Lorraine.
It's a problem. I don't have a babysitter for her today, so. But what I was saying is, I just see, as I'm interested in that kind of Catholic redemptive masculinity, they seem to. Christ is obviously a figure, sort of, for that, and I've just noticed a lot of drawing on Augustine. So mostly in Madam Secretary, with, I don't know if anybody watches that, but her husband is, so she becomes the Secretary of State, but her husband is like a Catholic theologian and professor. So he's constantly quoting Augustine, and there's other sort of movies and whatnot that draw on Augustine too, but I haven't been able to see kind of a clear line to him, or using him in a very clear particular way within this kind of discourse, if you will. So I was just interested in listening to what you said about the tensions and complexity in Augustine, which has always been my sense. So I'm wondering if it's more that the complexity and tensions and whatnot in Augustine just allow for, people to draw in various ways. So it's not so much that he offers a particular route, but that people have drawn on him in these social justice movements, in conceptions of democracy then and whatnot. And so we're going to see a lot of different, voices on him in this, especially with the current president as well. So it helped me to sort of confirmed for me what you're saying in terms of, again, there's so much there, right, in Augustine. And it was just bringing me back to the City of God. I haven't read it for a long time, so I was in hearing, or another reading. Yeah. So thanks for that.
Yeah. So this is another question sort of about the legacy of Augustine, I guess, in terms of, so you mentioned I haven't heard this actually, he's being used as sort of this figure to cultivate or to sort of reclaim the sort of masculine sort of sense of this proper sense of masculinity that's maybe been lost, I guess, according to some Christians. I don't know. There's obviously he's an ancient figure, so any sort of interpretation of him in contemporary times will be partial to one's own sort of political or ethical project, I guess. And so I guess we can see many ways that Augustine is being used that seem totally at like counter, in total opposition to one another. So Gregory, which is one person that I mentioned who is trying to do a retrieval of Augustine's ethical and political thought, tries to reclaim Augustine for a certain feminist ethic in terms of sort of reclaiming the affectivity that is found in much sort of feminist ethics, sort of this sort of attunement to our embodiedness and our relationality and all of these things, which Augustine was really at the forefront of many of these kinds of discourses in sort of the inception of I guess, Western Christianity. But he is not blameless on this front. I mean, his views on women and the role of women is patriarchal to a large extent, and he has this this view of the paterfamilias, sort of the head of the family, as being sort of the father at the top, and everyone sort of falling into this kind of complementarity in their proper role sort of thing. So to reclaim Augustine for a sort of egalitarian ethic is kind of problematic to some extent, but I think there are also good ways in which that might be done through some, maybe let's say, hermeneutical creativity. So there's all these different ways that Augustine's legacy, I think, continues with us. And yeah, like you said, there's all these, like even in pop culture, in sort of popular opinions, or even like Joe Biden, let's say, sort of citing Augustine. There's all these different ways that Augustine is still with us today. And so I'm hoping to not simplify these legacies of Augustine, but to sort of point out their continued complexity with us today.
I was just thinking that would be another interesting talk to think about, you know, Augustine and pop culture and how he's being depicted versus how he was interpreted or understood in his time, you know, and debated in our time. Any other questions from the audience? I do have one more question, but I want to see if anyone else wants to take. Okay, so my question is, I've been wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about what Augustine thinks is the most ethical way in which a judge should act. He's obviously critical of the Stoic approach to justice, but he's presenting a concrete, but is he presenting concrete suggestions by way of an alternative? Yeah, so what is,
Yeah, so as I think I've already mentioned that in chapter 6, it's a very short chapter. It's about 2 to 3 pages long. And like I said, it's mainly sort of this critical sort of discussion of a judge who he thinks is acting in the wrong way. So to find out what he thinks is the right way to act, you have to go, like I said, to his letters, to his sort of his concrete interactions with public officials of his day, trying to recommend that they act more gently and more humanely. So I think to kind of boil it down, his main piece of advice would be to like try to interpret the situation as correctly as possible. So not like just to let everyone off the hook willy-nilly, but like to actually use one's reason to provide sort of the best judgment to one's ability, even given this problem of hiddenness that I've been talking about. But he's going to say also that that in many cases mercy can be warranted, even if sort of that wouldn't maybe fulfill the strict letter of what the law would recommend. And he thinks that in many ways the correct use of power is in many ways to renounce one's total power over others, but to humbly approach sort of the other human being in terms of their full humanity, and not merely like as a criminal, let's say. So as a Christian, of course, Augustine is going to think that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So this is sort of the scriptural paradigm that he'll return to again and again. So like sort of this paradigm of sinfulness is very different than the paradigm of criminality, let's say. So I think he's always going to be struggling with this tension between providing I guess recommendations for how to fulfill the human law, but then also he's also going to be considering this in light of how to fulfill sort of this higher divine law that in some sense sort of escapes the conventions that we have sort of in our own courts of justice and with our own sort of humanly prescribed laws. So yeah, again, it's these types of tensions that I'm trying to draw attention to in Augustine.
And I'm just gonna keep talking since no one else is, but but just in the concept of hiddenness, I noticed that when you use it in the beginning, and I were you also using it like this? Is hiddenness ignorance, like just not knowing like the full like the holistic understanding of like a situation, or? Yeah.
So this is an issue of me trying to translate my own paper for presentation purposes. So in the full paper, I kind of give this fuller account of Augustine's theological anthropology. So he's going to kind of go to the scriptural account of Adam and Eve, and he gives like this really lengthy account of the fall, sort of this sort of mythological account of the fall of human beings from a state of grace into their fallen sort of sinful state. And part of this, he thinks, is that human beings become hidden from one another. So there's a sort of primitive transparency that we fall from into the sort of state of hiddenness that we have from each other. So now we need sort of this imperfect medium of language with which to communicate. And so in other parts of Book 19, Augustine will discuss the problem of interpersonal relationships where, let's say, the betrayal of a friend, for example, cannot be foreseen because their intentions, their thoughts are always going to be hidden from us. So even if they're saying one thing, they might be thinking another, and we have no way of knowing this really. So that's sort of the underlying anthropological feature of Augustine's thought that I really wasn't addressing too explicitly in the paper, but that's sort of, maybe I should have, because that would clear up this this issue we have encountered, but that's sort of the theological, anthropological issue that Augustine is struggling with. So like how we are to approach this issue of not even being able to know what the intentions of others are, despite what they might be saying. And this also, of course, applies to the judge's dilemma, because a person might obviously lie on the stand to get out of being indicted or being convicted of a crime, but they might also lie under the rack because they're being tortured. So there's all these types of really kind of horrible situations that Augustine is concerned with. And he thinks that all of these ultimately kind of boil down to this problem of hiddenness, which he thinks is this really sort of irreducible feature of human life, here and now sort of thing.
Well, thank you so much for, oh, Michael, did you want to say something?
Yeah, if there's time, Jonas, thanks for your paper. That was really interesting. And I picked up that comment about hiddenness too. I'm glad Alicia kind of leaned into that, because I think that's just really interesting. And I'm also thinking about that, the hiddenness of God, right? There's this the masking of God, or the unknown about God. But what I was interested in you talking about Niebuhr and aligning him with the realists. I thought that was really fascinating. Are you, when you're quoting the scholars today, are you seeing a critical tradition in Catholic scholarship today that would push back against Niebuhr? Is that something you've looked at, or is that not really an area you've leaned into? Because I would be interested if you found some critical Catholic scholarship kind of pushing back on Niebuhr's position on this.
That might be a failing on my part, because I think I've tend to have read more Protestant interpreters of Augustine, because like his influence goes far beyond the bounds of Catholicism, as you probably know. So like for the Protestant Reformation, he was very influential on Luther, and so through the whole sort of Catholic and Protestant traditions, he sort of had this influence. So unfortunately, I haven't looked too specifically at Catholic responses to just sort of this sort of political realism. Obama, for example, his favorite theologian was Niebuhr. So there's all these sorts of complicated lineages that we find in appropriations of Augustine's thought. So maybe that's sort of a good indication for me that I should maybe start reading the Catholics on this question a little bit better, because I think it would probably be very valuable to see sort of what has been said in this regard.
Yeah, and I'm not suggesting I know any particular critic. I just, it's an interesting strand. And I'm very much rooted in the Protestant tradition too, so that would be exactly where I would probably start, and probably find a lot of fruitful stuff as you've done. But yeah, just an interesting thought about particularly, sort of critical Catholic scholarship, probably in the last 20 or 30 years. There might be some interesting things there. So yeah, anyways, just thanks for what you shared with us today. Really, really rich stuff. So appreciate that, Jonas.
Yeah, and thanks for coming to listen and to ask questions. I appreciate it. And in terms of Augustine and pop culture, I don't know if anybody has seen the Simpsons episode where Homer sort of recreates Augustine's conversion experience by being baptized. It just came to mind as this issue of Augustine and pop culture came up. So if anyone is teaching religion and pop culture, go look up that Simpsons episode, because it's pretty funny.
But the problem, Jonas, is that most of the students these days don't know much about The Simpsons. We have to go to more recent pop culture references, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's all on Disney Plus. I mean,
it's all. I know, right? That's why.
Yeah,
well,
the kids
thank you
these
so
days.
much.
Right?
Yeah,
Yes,
No, and I just wanted to say, like, thank you so much, because I learned so much, because again, like, I'm a few members of our audience, I'm not really, as versed as I would like to be in the classics. So I learned a lot. I'm happy that you clarified some terminology, because now I'm like, oh, okay, now this is all kind of coming together a bit better for me. So thank you. It was a really great learning experience for myself. I do want to remind, I think Sarah usually does this at the end, but just in case, if anyone missed anything in this lecture, all of our webinars are on our CSSR account on YouTube. So you can always go and tune in there. This one should be available tomorrow. So feel free to share with your networks. And I'll pass it over to Sarah now to conclude. And again, thank you all for coming. And thank you so much, Jonas, for your lecture. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Alicia, and thank you, Jonas, for your talk. It was, like Alicia, not an expert in this, but really fascinating. It's always great to hear more about it, so thank you for that. I'll even have the YouTube video up, maybe even this evening, depending on how fast my computer uploads things this evening. But yeah, it's up on our YouTube channel as usual, so please go check it out, pass the word. I'll send the link to all of you by email. I usually do at the end of the talk, so once it's up, you'll have that. And so I just want to share one quick promo poster for our next webinar. So this is our last webinar. Wow, it's gone by fast for this term. This is with our CSSR president, Paul Garot, and CSSR executive member, Janine Leblanc, both from the University of Alberta. They're going to be giving a talk on the 1st of April, same day of the week, same time, so Thursday, 3 p.m. Eastern, titled Decolonizing Religious Studies, Approaches and Insights from Native Studies, their current home department at the University of Alberta. So we're looking forward to that. You sign up for these webinars the same way as you signed up for Jonas's or past webinars. It's on that same Google form. I've got the link here. I include the link. You find it in our CSSR newsletter as well to register. And then I just email you the Zoom meeting details about a week before, or whenever you end up registering just before the talk. So if you want to stop by to that one, that'll be another great one. And it's a nice way to wrap up the winter term before we get into our actual spring conference later on in the year at the end of May. So yeah, thanks again for coming this afternoon. Great to see you all, and hope to see many of you in about a month's time on the 1st of April for that talk. All right. Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.